She can introduce our talent. Just do your thing, Jess.
Yeah.
It's all good.
Did you get a chance to print out that stuff?
I've got everything.
You're amazing. Derek is amazing. You guys are blessed to have Derek. Okay, so I'm going to introduce myself. For those who don't know me well, my name is. I'm just going to check that this goes across. No,
I'll do it. I'll fix it for you in a minute.
I'll fix for me in a minute. Cool.
Yeah.
So yes, my name is Jess. I have been working for Compassion for almost 9 years, and so today's topic is economic injustice, and that's kind of what gives me a bit of insight into poverty and things like that, and kind of working in that role for a number of time. I've had lots of different roles within this time that I've worked at Compassion. Some of them have been field-based, so I have gone to every continent that we work in, Central America, Africa, Asia, and been exposed to a lot of worlds that are different contexts to ours. And my current role there is, it's got a fancy title. It's a Strategic Partnerships Optimization and Enablement Manager. Yeah, well, we just changed the name because it used to be Ministry Partnerships instead of Strategic Partnerships. So we used to call it MPO for short, which was easier. And we've been going for the team's been going for less than a year, and we kind of work in the innovation space on how do we serve the local church, how do we serve our local major givers, and how do we serve our ambassadors in a way that's mutually beneficial. And so it's a bit of this fun national team that I get to be part of. There's only one other team member in Perth, so I spend a lot of time on Zoom. But it's cool, it's good. And so I guess that kind of brings me into what we're speaking about today. We are having an economic justice ethics, and then we're going to talk about a Christian response to that. The reality is when you see it, it's a lot easier to understand the complexity of poverty. So a bit of a plan for today. Is that too small or is it? Oh, it's okay. So introductions, I have done that now. Tick. We're going to talk a bit about the biblical mandate. So we're going to go through the Old and the New Testament, looking at the idea of social justice and God's heart for the poor. Then we're going to dive into understanding poverty. So we're going to talk about some concepts around that are not necessarily church-based, they're kind of industry-based. And then we'll talk about injustice and your role to play in that. Cool. I am so happy that if you guys want to interrupt, ask questions, and kind of flow. I do kind of create a lecture that has lots of moments of that in between. So we can kind of go through it that way, but you can see the cheeky faces that are like, you shouldn't have said that. So first question, what does God say about injustice? So when you think about injustice, what are some scriptures off the top of your head that you can think of?
Injustice. Which narrative?
Yep.
Oh yeah.
Where is it?
Where?
I'm just teasing. I'm teasing. No, Good Samaritan's a great example.
Do you want
What
me to pull it out?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
We will be doing some scripture reading later.
I know. I always think back in the old days, like the Bible, the leprosy and all that, being cast aside, and kind of bringing it to now, who's being cast aside and stuff.
Yeah, definitely. We see just the way Jesus treats people as a model for us on how to respond to injustice. Well, there are actually more than 2,000 verses in the Bible on the matters. Welcome to Bible knowledge, guys. On the matters of poverty, wealth, injustice, and the value that God places on people. So what we find is God has given us a responsibility for the poor. And in the Old Testament, we find this an old Jewish concept. So we're going to start right back at old Jewish law. And it's about leaving some of our excess for the poor and disenfranchised. And we can read it in this Leviticus. I've pulled up the Message version. And it says, when you reap the harvest of your land, don't reap the corners of your field or gather the gleanings. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am God, your God. So when he says, I am God, your God, that's him going, listen, I'm in charge, do what I say, essentially. It's a real reinforcement of what that point is. So this old Levitical law is also referenced in Deuteronomy, and it's all throughout Leviticus as one of God's ways of reaching out to the poor. And in those times, and I guess in the context of this scripture, the Jewish people were often the most successful or the most wealthy people in the land, and God was instructing them to be generous with the blessings that they had. And instead of reaping every crop that they had for themselves, so they could make more money for themselves and store up for the future, God actually instructs them to leave some for those in need. So it's kind of like leave the edges so that someone else can come and glean from them. You see, God doesn't always provide manna from heaven, because sometimes he provides for his people through his people. And I think that's the big thing that we can learn from that. So what God says about injustice is God has given us a responsibility for the poor, and you've got the scriptural references there, so you can take note of those and remember them for the future. But that's all that same Levitical law about not gleaning everything for yourselves, but leaving some for others. So what else does God say? There are a bunch of other scriptures that God talks about injustice in the poor. So we've got a few listed there, and because we've got 3 people, what I'm going to do is each one of you are going to read out one of these, but there's a little meditation point. So we're going to read these out, and then I want you to sit and I want you to reflect for a solid 2 minutes. So it's not going to be that hard. Solid 2 minutes on what is the question that's being answered here in these scriptures that we're going to read over. What is religion, and what is its outworking in my life? And how do I please God, and how do I draw the attention of God? So do we want to do the readings all together and then have the little reflection moment? All right, so who wants to read Amos 5:21 to 24?
I got it.
I'll get mine for you.
Yeah, great.
I despise religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not sing to the music of your hearts, but let justice flow on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream.
Someone want to do Micah 6:8?
With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of water? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God.
Someone get that Isaiah one?
That is not the path that I've chosen, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out, when you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh.
You can do 8 as well.
18.
Verse 8.
Just read.
Yes.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I've got that. Then your light shall break forth like the morning, your healing shall spring forth speedily, and your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard.
Right, so before we go to the New Testament, I might unpack some of those real quickly. So that Amos scripture, actually no, let's read the New Testament ones and then you'll have the reflection. Sorry, I changed my mind. I can read this one. 1 John 3, verse 16 to 18. This is how we know what love is. Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with action and in truth. And then someone want to grab James?
Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world.
Cool. All right, so let's take 2 minutes. So it's 7:27. I'll come back and ask that meditation question. What questions are being answered here? So if you want to go back and read over them, really just think about them, then we're going to discuss that. Cool. Just 30 more seconds. Fun little thing, if you're really interested in this topic, I wrote a 10,000 word paper on James 1:27, which you're more than welcome to read. It
10,000 pages.
was my thesis for my
I don't want to come to your slum.
That's one verse.
Yeah.
all right, so what are some themes that you guys are noticing in these scriptures? I'm gonna use a whiteboard because I never get to use a whiteboard and it's fun.
Do it. Do
I
it.
love the Bible, I love it.
What's some themes that you're seeing?
God prefers justice over sacrifice.
Righteousness.
Wow,
A little
it's
greater
actually-
than
it's actually pretty good.
Jack, you gotta up your game from whiteboard there.
Yeah.
What else are we noticing? I don't have to write that whole sentence. I was like, how do I just shorten this?
Righteousness.
Yeah, go.
Righteousness, sorry.
Ben coming through with a one-word answer.
Yeah, boy.
Oh, do you want that now or do you want it? in the same
Yeah,
thing?
Look,
However you want to write it.
No, what do you think?
Well, it talks about like being righteous is actually loving.
Yeah.
people and all that, and doing right by God is actually, I guess being righteous is doing what God says, so you have to love God. And it's not even like a choice, it's basically His commandment. In order to be righteous, we actually have to do this.
What else?
I guess it talked about how to love the man, or how to love the poor, and how to outwork it. Thank you for your. I did try.
well,
I
I
did
got
really
you
try.
back.
I
I got
did
you
really
back. I got
try.
you back.
Yeah. I do like this.
Yeah.
Still trying.
Anything else? In some of those Old Testament ones, there's this theme of God actually ignoring the things that we offer Him as worship when we're ignoring matters of injustice. So sometimes, I think that's quite a convicting thing. Like in that Amos scripture, He's like, I don't care about your festivals, don't care about the songs you sing to me, if injustice is like happening amongst you.
Wow. Wait. So, hold on.
Yeah.
Boom. Light bulb moment. So would that mean for churches that actually don't do outreach to their community aren't actually pleasing God with worship?
I don't know. What do you guys think?
Hey,
Because I think we've seen the other side as well, where people only care about injustice, and then they're actually not honoring God with righteous lives and with worship.
100%. It's definitely a balance, but I feel like if there's something that they're ignoring, like there's a need that they're not meeting.
Yeah.
And
it's
just
like you're saying, wisdom, the fact that can you meet that need now? Or is there another need? Because there's always going to be needs. But when do you, so if you don't do that, but do something else, is that?
but like if they ignore, let's say they have the means to do the need, but they ignore it.
Okay, that's
But I think we all, like, let's be real. I think we all do it that to an extent. We live very prosperous
yeah.
lives, yeah.
We're also-
I drove past a car that was parked on the side of the road today. Like literally before I got here.
Yeah.
Anytime. It's like, no.
Not today. And I think if you dive into the James scripture, what is it? What's the James scripture? It talks about there's this balance, and I'm not going to get into the detail, but when you look at the Greek of it,
Please.
I haven't prepared to go into the detail, but there's two things happening here after the colon. So you've got looking after orphans and widows were very symbolic in that time of the vulnerable people of community. So when you read that, you don't need to think literal orphans and widows today. You can almost relate it to anyone who's vulnerable. So you could say refugees in replace for that, or something like that. And then it balances says and the joining word is not one of those like one's greater than the other. It's a joining word for and it talks about then keeping oneself unpolluted from the world. And so this book was actually written to mainly Jewish people. Even though it's in the New Testament, it was really written and framed for the Jewish listener. And that being kept unpolluted from the world was it was a symbol of who they are. The Jews saw themselves as the pure people because of their connection with God and as God's chosen people. And so that was something that they held in really high esteem. And so what this verse is doing is saying, caring for those people that are disenfranchised are equal weight of the thing that you value the most of your religiosity. And so those are things like parallels in it. That's how you can write lots of things about that one verse. So it's really fun when you look at it and you see these themes of basically God's putting a lot of value on responding to injustice and to poverty and like all those things that we kind of know exist in the world, maybe don't exist in our periphery. So I guess there is this theme of walking with God. When you walk with God, you learn about his character and what's important to him. And this is in both Old and New Testament. I very strategically picked some from both sections of the Bible because it's a theme of who God is caring for those that are vulnerable. So that's, second point. So first one is God gives us the responsibility for the poor, and that's in those Levitical laws. You see that he uses people to respond to the need, not just providing miraculously from heaven all the time. And then the second point is God judges those who ignore or oppress the poor. So then we're going to read Matthew 25, 31 to 47. Someone want to read it? Take turns, read a couple of verses and pass it on. Probably extend my life for using this also. I realise it's a lot harder to write on there than I thought.
It's all right. You stood it well for the time that it was given to you.
We have grace.
Thank you.
All right, so 31 to 47, right?
46.
You want 46? Okay, cool. And the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him. Then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And that's the 37. Yep, cool, great. Wrong number. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Then he will say to those on the left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick, and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they also will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you? And he will answer to them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life.
So it's a challenging passage of scripture, and often we actually stop at 40, verse 40, because that's kind of the like, yeah, God says to go and do this likewise, and it's framed positively, and then it gets retold again, but in a negative, where like you're ending up in condemnation. So it's not just go and do likewise. Jesus actually finishes the I guess parable saying, if you don't go and do likewise, there are dire consequences. You're going to be separated from God. And that's really challenging. And if you're looking at the context that passage is in within the text, there's two parables before that really talk about action. So you've got the parable of the talents, and the author is encouraging action. So it's nothing is random in the Bible. Everything has a place and a purpose. And so the fact that this is after a bunch of parables encouraging us to take action, it's not a metaphorical instruction from Jesus. It's a physical prompt to take action on the things that he's given us. And the other thing that I kind of like, and I noticed about this, was the parallels that you see there from the Isaiah 58 scripture that you read out, Paul, where it talks about visiting those in prison, giving food to the hungry. Like, that's not the first time that this is mentioned in the Bible. It's just the first time Jesus kind of brought it up. So Jesus's life is this profound example of what it means to live committed to social justice. And throughout the New Testament, we see, and we've talked about this earlier today, we see Jesus stand for social injustice in the way he embraces those who are excluded based on their social status, their gender, their ethnicity even, and their age. And it's a real powerful example of being impartial and valuing equality. And when we read these stories of Jesus, he often challenges the oppressive systems that are in place. So he confronts power brokers of these systems, like the tax collectors, the rulers, those with political power, even spiritual leaders. He denounces cultural and religious practices and that create a barrier for fulfilling our commandment of love our neighbor as ourselves. You know, that's the second greatest commandment that we're to live by. And he advocates on behalf of the poor and the oppressed, to the point of actually equating the needs of meeting the poor to serving Christ himself. So this emphasis on love and acceptance and fairness and justice combined together is what gives us this idea of social justice. And I mentioned before that there are over 2,000 verses throughout the Bible that speaks on the issues of poverty, injustice, and fairness. And in light of this biblical weight, it's really hard for us as Christians, or to find a Christian in this day and age that doesn't actually see that would argue that social justice isn't important. So before Josh, you mentioned, if a church isn't reaching their local community, are they actually being a church? And I think that's probably one of the main points that I want to say today. Yes, that is true. And it's challenging, right? So what does a life modeled after Christ, being founded on that Micah 6:8 verse, where it talks about act justly, love mercy, but walk humbly as well. So it's not go around and toot your own horn about all the good works and good deeds you're doing. It's like, how do you do all these things together? What does God actually need us to do? Yeah, that's the third point. I forgot to say that, but I think you picked it up. So thinking about the biblical mandate and this context of God's character caring about injustice, we're gonna divert now into that economic injustice. We're gonna start talking about what is poverty. So if I was to ask you guys, what is poverty? How would you describe it?
Status.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Hey, I live in Kwinana, so no, it's all good. What else?
No, I just think about the social determinants of whether you have a job, whether family, how you live your life, and your mom shrank when she was pregnant with you.
Yeah, you end up with conditions. Yeah.
Genetic conditions, and then addicted to drugs or alcohol, that also plays a part in that.
If you guys had to define poverty, how would you define it?
Living a life of lack.
Lacking,
This
destitute. Yeah. I think it's really easy to fall into.
Wait, so serious.
That's okay. I think the thing is, it's really easy. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking poverty is actually a physical problem. So it's not having enough money, not having economic needs, not having education, coming from an abusive background, not having enough to eat or access to medical treatment, being forced to drink dirty water. Like, these are the things that we think what poverty is. But the truth is poverty involves, yes, the physical and the economic hardship, but it's also important to note there are other forms of poverty. So you can have spiritual poverty, you can be lacking in, so when you said lacking, like that was a good open-ended, leave that as lacking. You can have socio-emotional, so not socio-economic, socio-emotional poverty, where you don't have a community around you, and so you're isolated. And so when you think about poverty, you have to see that it's actually really complex, because it isn't just about money or physical needs. Otherwise, we could solve the problem tomorrow because there's enough resources in the world. So one of the fancy definitions of poverty is a condition characterized by the deprivation of basic human needs, the denial of opportunity. So opportunity is a really important part here, because if you don't have opportunity to overcome your circumstances, you're never going to be able to. And the deficiency of internal assets, so internal assets being your drive, someone believing in you, prevent a person from realizing their basic God-given potential. There's another definition. Poverty is a result of relationships that do not work. So they are not just, they are not life, they are not harmonious or enjoyable. Poverty is the absence of shalom in all its meanings. So that's from Brian Myers, and he talks about understanding poverty through relationships. So I'm going to dive a bit more into what Brian Myers says, and he defines these relationships like this. So it shows our primary relationship with God, you can see kind of going up, and other relationships we have with ourselves, with others, with the rest of creation, all flow from this primary relationship. And these relationships are the building blocks of our societies. So with the economic, social, religious, and political systems determining how these relationships are managed. So it's important to note as well that these arrows go both ways. So they indicate that people affect the systems also affect the people. So what happens in poverty is the breakdown of these relationships. And this diagram here shows how the breakdown of our relationship with God at the fall has affected man's relationship with himself, with others, and the rest of creation as well. So self-interest, greed, pride are just a few of the, I guess, devastating sins that are caused by the breakdown of our relationship with God that have wreaked havoc in our political, economic, social, and religious systems. So when we look at these diagrams, I guess what's the ramifications when we're labeling who is poor?
Who's Paul or
Yeah.
who is Paul?
Not who's Paul. Paul is the man sitting on the end of the table there. But who is poor? P-O-O-R. So when we talk about who is poor, straight away I think we have an image in our head. But if we're understanding poverty and lack, what does that mean when we look at these broken relationships? So who is poor? Almost. There's different levels of, are we poor of spirit? Are we poor of relationship with others? Are we poor of economic means? And the other thing is you've got these other systems that speak into that as well. So we're gonna look at Mary's story, and I think Derek has a handout for you guys. Yes, there. So Mary's story is a really good way to break down these diagrams into a real life situation. So we're going to read Mary's story, and I will read it for you, and you can read along, and then we're going to answer a bunch of questions, and that's why we've got the printout, because last time I didn't do the printout and I moved on to the slide that had the questions, and everyone kept forgetting what was in the story. So that's why we have a printout today, but let me read you Mary's story. So Mary lives in a slum in Western Kenya. As a female in a male-dominated society, Mary has been subjected to polygamy, regular verbal and physical abuse from her husband, fewer years of schooling than males, and an entire cultural system that tells her she is inferior. As a result, Mary has a poverty of being and lacks the confidence to look for a job, which has led her into material poverty. Desperate, Mary decides to be self-employed, but needs to get a loan to get her business started. Unfortunately, her poverty of community rears its ugly head, and the local loan sharks exploits Mary, demanding an interest rate of 300% on her loan of $25, contributing to Mary's material poverty. Having no other options, Mary borrows from the loan shark and starts a business selling homemade charcoal in the local market, along with hundreds of others just like her. The market is glutted with charcoal sellers, which keeps the price very low. It never occurs to Mary to sell something else, because she does not understand that she has been given the creativity and the capacity to have dominion over creation. In other words, her poverty of stewardship locks her into an unprofitable business, further contributing to her material poverty. Frustrated by her entire situation, Mary goes to a traditional healer or a witch doctor for help, a manifestation of her poverty of spiritual intimacy with the true God. The healer tells Mary that her difficult life is a result of angry ancestral spirits that need to be appeased by sacrificing a bull. This sacrifice costs Mary a substantial amount of money and further contributes to her material poverty. So here's some questions for us to reflect on. Can you guys identify what are some of the broken relationships in Mary's life? let's talk about specifics. What are some specific relationships that we can see?
Your husband.
A husband.
Society,
Yeah.
School,
Yep.
Loan shark.
education,
Yeah.
Oh, I feel sorry for this poor girl. Oh my goodness.
Mary's story is replicated around the world. Just give you that little insight.
Yeah,
It's
well,
quite
hey,
sad.
Whoa, that was not an opening. Don't do that to me. Don't do that to me.
It's sad, and it's
I
sad.
don't want to cry tonight.
I have built a natural resilience to hearing some of these stories because I've heard them over and over again, and it breaks your heart because
What's that called? That's called compassion.
compassion fatigue. Well,
Yeah,
like by Sack said, it's just resilience because I still can manage it and do my job. You know. Anyway, will giving Mary more money solve her problems?
No.
Easy to recognize
Yes.
when you see it like
Money makes the world go round.
this. But how many times do we just respond by throwing money at a situation? Not just in these like international worlds. What about in our own? Think about Aboriginal communities. There's been a lot of money thrown into those situations and then not necessarily better off.
Just so you need to thank you.
Yeah. Okay, what are some solutions for Mary's problem? Yeah, education. God.
Yeah, that, God.
Yeah.
A supportive husband.
Yeah, he's not married to like 5 other women.
Wait, what?
That's what polygamy is. Polygamy is multiple wives.
Uh-huh. Yes, yes,
It's a
yes.
nice way of saying it.
Yeah.
Keeps on getting better. Oh, no.
Go see a psychologist.
Yeah,
Well, she did.
witch doctor. Yeah.
Didn't really help at all.
Right, I'm going to tell you another story.
Oh,
So this is Christine. I met her back in 2016. She was here in Perth sharing about her story. She's one of our Compassion alumni who has kind of grown up through the program, and she comes from a country called Rwanda. So if you haven't heard of Rwanda before, in 1994 they had a genocide, and so over 1 million of a certain racial group was slaughtered over 100 days. And yeah, it's pretty intense. So
When was this?
1994,
wait, over 1 million?
over 1 million.
Over 1 million. I want to do some math real quick. Sorry.
A lot of people. But I wanted to share Christine's story because her story is definitely a story of hope. And she has come kind of full circle now. She is in full-time employment in Rwanda. I literally had a Zoom call with her last month and she's doing great. But her story didn't always start like that. So I'm not trying to give you a compassion sales pitch, but it's just a story I can show you like that's, you know, balancing out because I've seen it and witnessed it, right? So there are a few things that happen in Christine's story that show about these broken relationships and how they were mended over time. So that's compassion sales pitch there. So I'm going to move past that. So this is Christine's family. So during the genocide, she witnessed her mother being macheted to death. And yeah, her father was also killed in the genocide. And so she was found herself orphaned. And she had to witness these terrible things, but then also had to go and live with some of her brothers and cousins and live with this auntie. And they moved to a new community called Chimichanga, which is like a slum that was in that area. And it was a really dangerous area. It's full of prostitution and drugs, gangs, all those social issues that kind of come from slums. And there wasn't always enough food for her. And going to school actually at the time wasn't even an option because the auntie that was caring for them couldn't afford to send them all, and she was a girl, so she wasn't going to be valued to get that schooling. So what happened was her auntie found out about a local church who was running a compassion program, and she was able to go, and Christine was registered through the program. But Christine doesn't just get education and food and healthcare, which are all basic things that get offered through the program, but she got trauma counselling, and she also had a sponsor who would write letters to her and tell her that they believed in her. She had a whole bunch of things. And when I met Christine this first time, oh, sorry, that's Chimichanga there. And this is Christine's family now. So there's the same people that were in that childhood photo before. And Christine is on my right in the like light blue blouse. And I lost track of what I was saying. Oh, I asked Christine when I first met her, because I mean, we were here on a roadshow with Compassion, and she was sharing her story at different churches and events, and some of them were interviews, and I kind of was like, well, what was the most valuable part of the Compassion program for you? And she actually responded, she's like, the most valuable part was that when I was 14, I was at a church camp and I found Jesus. And so she gave her life to Christ. And now when she talks about it, she actually talks about having that spiritual redemption is even more powerful and life-changing than having the access to education and healthcare in her time of need. And at the start of 2020, I was in Rwanda before COVID happened. So this was in January 2020, and I'm actually sitting in her living room. She's not living in a slum anymore. That's a very nice living room. Her house is bigger than my house. So I was like, hey. But she at the time so she was actually living with family as well there, but she was working as a child protection officer for Save the Children in refugee camps on the border of Burundi. So she had been so challenged by how much she had received that her life and her career path is now about helping others because she's been released from poverty. And her ambitions are great. She's studied political science. She has this real passion to be in politics and see strong leadership in her country, so that things like the genocide don't happen again. So that's kind of a picture of how, like, she had all these broken relationships in her life, but it wasn't just getting the goods and services. It wasn't just getting opportunities. It wasn't just the spiritual. It was kind of this combination of all these relationships being mended in her life. So that's one view of poverty. Now, Derek is going to show us a video. There's a slide that you guys have access to these slides. And here's some further reading. If you are interested in this topic, these are some really helpful books for you to learn about. But we have a video now.
Yes, you do. So,
To be honest, by personality, I'm just not much of a crier. But I think in my career, that's been a good thing. I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I've seen some horrible things in the world. I began my career working police abuse cases in the United States, and then in 1994, I was sent to Rwanda to be the director of the UN's genocide investigation. It turns out that tears aren't just much help when you're trying to investigate a genocide. The things I had to see and feel and touch were pretty unspeakable. What I can tell you is this, that the Rwandan genocide was one of the world's greatest failures of simple compassion. That word compassion actually comes from two Latin words, cum passio, which simply mean to suffer with. And the things that I saw and experienced in Rwanda as I got up close to human suffering, it did, in moments, move me to tears. But I just wish that I and the rest of the world had been moved earlier. And not just to tears, but to actually stop the genocide. Now, by contrast, I've also been involved with one of the world's greatest successes of compassion. And that's the fight against global poverty. It's a cause that probably has involved all of us here. I don't know if your first introduction might have been choruses of We Are the World, or maybe the picture of a sponsored child on your refrigerator door, or maybe the birthday you donated for fresh water. I don't really remember what my first introduction to poverty was, but I do remember the most jarring. It was when I met Venus. She's a mom from Zambia. She's got 3 kids and she's a widow. When I met her, she had walked about 12 miles in the only garment she owned to come to the capital city and to share her story. And she sat down with me for hours and just ushered me in to the world of poverty. She described what it was like when the coals on the cooking fire finally just went completely cold, when that last drop of cooking oil finally ran out, when the last of the food, despite her best efforts, ran out. She had to watch her youngest son, Peter, suffer from malnutrition as his legs just slowly bowed into uselessness, as his eyes grew cloudy and dim, and then as Peter finally grew cold. For over 50 years, stories like this have been moving us to compassion. We whose kids have plenty to eat. And we're moved not only to care about global poverty, but to actually try to do our part to stop the suffering. Now, there's plenty of room for critique that we haven't done enough, and what it is that we've done hasn't been effective enough. But the truth is this: the fight against global poverty is probably the broadest, longest running manifestation of the human phenomenon of compassion in the history of our species. And so I'd like to share a pretty shattering insight that might forever change the way you think about that struggle. But first, let me begin with what you probably already know. 35 years ago, when I would have been graduating from high school, they told us that 40,000 kids every day died because of poverty. That number today is now down to 17,000. Way too many, of course, but it does mean that every year there's 8 million kids who don't have to die from poverty. Moreover, the number of people in our world who are living in extreme poverty, which is defined as living off about $1.25 a day, that has fallen from 50% to only 15%. This is massive progress, and this exceeds everybody's expectations about what is possible. And I think you and I think honestly that we can feel proud and encouraged to see the way that compassion actually has the power to succeed in stopping the suffering of millions. But here's the part that you might not hear very much about. If you move that poverty mark just up to $2 a day, it turns out that virtually the same 2 billion people who were stuck in that harsh poverty when I was in high school are still stuck there 35 years later. So why? Why are so many billions still stuck in such harsh poverty? Well, let's think about Venus for a moment. Now, for decades, my wife and I have been moved by common compassion to sponsor kids, to fund microloans, to support generous levels of foreign aid. But until I had actually talked to Venus, I would have had no idea that none of those approaches actually addressed why she had to watch her son die. We were doing fine, Venus told me, until Brutus started to cause trouble. Now, Brutus is Venus's neighbor, and caused trouble is what happened the day after Venus's husband died. When Brutus just came and threw Venus and the kids out of the house, stole all their land, and robbed their market stall. You see, Venus was thrown into destitution by violence. And then it occurred to me, of course, that none of my child sponsorships, none of the microloans, none of the traditional anti-poverty programs were going to stop Brutus, because they weren't meant to. This became even more clear to me when I met Griselda. She's a marvelous young girl living in a very poor community in Guatemala. And one of the things we've learned over the years is that perhaps the most powerful thing that Griselda and her family can do to get Griselda and the family out of poverty is to make sure that she goes to school. The experts call this the girl effect. But when we met Griselda, she wasn't going to school. In fact, she was rarely ever leaving her home. Days before we met her, while she was walking home from church with her family in broad daylight, men from her community just snatched her off the street and violently raped her. See, Griselda had every opportunity to go to school. It just wasn't safe for her to get there. And Griselda's not the only one. Around the world, poor women and girls between the ages of 15 and 44, they are, when victims of the everyday violence of domestic abuse and sexual violence, those two forms of violence account for more death and disability then malaria, then car accidents, then war combined. The truth is, the poor of our world are trapped in whole systems of violence. In South Asia, for instance, I could drive past this rice mill and see this man hoisting these 100-pound sacks of rice upon his thin back. But I would have no idea until later that he was actually a slave, held by violence in that rice mill since I was in high school. Decades of anti-poverty programs right in his community were never able to rescue him or any of the 100 other slaves from the beatings and the rapes and the torture of violence inside the rice mill. In fact, half a century of anti-poverty programs have left more poor people in slavery than in any other time in human history. Experts tell us that there's about 35 million people in slavery today. That's about the population of the entire nation of Canada, where we're sitting today. This is why, over time, I have come to call this epidemic of violence the locust effect. Because in the lives of the poor, it just descends like a plague and it destroys everything. In fact, now when you survey very, very poor communities, residents will tell you that their greatest fear is violence. But notice the violence that they fear is not the violence of genocide or the wars. It's everyday violence. So for me as a lawyer, of course, my first reaction was to think, well, of course, we've got to change all the laws, right? We've got to make all this violence against the poor illegal. But then I found out it already is. The problem is not that the poor don't get laws, it's that they don't get law enforcement. In the developing world, basic law enforcement systems are so broken that recently the UN issued a report that found that, quote, most poor people live outside the protection of law. Now, honestly, you and I have just about no idea of what that would mean because we have no firsthand experience of it. Functioning law enforcement for us is just a total assumption. In fact, nothing expresses that assumption more clearly than 3 simple numbers: 911, which of course is the number for the emergency police operator here in Canada and in the United States, where the average response time to a police 911 emergency call is about 10 minutes. So we take this just completely for granted. But what if there was no law enforcement to protect you? A woman in Oregon recently experienced what this would be like. She was home alone in her dark house on a Saturday night when a man started to tear his way into her home. This was her worst nightmare because this man had actually put her in the hospital from an assault just 2 weeks before. So terrified, she picks up that phone and does what any of us would do. She calls 911. But only to learn that because of budget cuts in her county, law enforcement wasn't available on the weekends. Listen.
I don't have anybody to send out there. Okay. Obviously, if he comes inside the residence and assaults you, can you ask him to go away, or do you know if he's intoxicated or anything?
I've already asked him. I've already told him I was calling you. He's spoken before, busted down my door, assaulted me. So.
Is there any way you can safely leave the residence?
No, I can't. Because he's blocking pretty much my only way out.
Well, the only thing I can do is give you some advice and call the sheriff's office tomorrow. Obviously, if he comes in and unfortunately has a weapon or is trying to cause you physical harm, that's a different story. The sheriff's office doesn't work up there. I don't have anybody to send.
Tragically, the woman inside that house was violently assaulted, choked, and raped. Because this is what it means to live outside the rule of law. And this is where billions of our poorest live. What does that look like? In Bolivia, for example, if a man sexually assaults a poor child, statistically, he's at greater risk of slipping in the shower and dying than he is of ever going to jail for that crime. In South Asia, if you enslave a poor person, you're at greater risk of being struck by lightning than ever being sent to jail for that crime. And so the epidemic of everyday violence, it just rages on. And it devastates our efforts to try to help billions of people out of their $2 a day hell. Because the data just doesn't lie. It turns out that you can give all manner of goods and services to the poor, but if you don't restrain the hands of the violent bullies from taking it all away, you're going to be very disappointed in the long-term impact of your efforts. So you would think that the disintegration of basic law enforcement in the developing world would be a huge priority for the global fight against poverty. But it's not. Auditors of international assistance recently couldn't find even 1% of aid going to protect the poor from the lawless chaos of everyday violence. And honestly, when we do talk about violence against the poor, sometimes it's in the weirdest of ways. A freshwater organization tells a heart-wrenching story of girls who are raped on the way to fetching water, and then celebrates the solution of a new well that drastically shortens their walk. End of story. But not a word about the rapists who are still right there in the community. If a young woman on one of our college campuses was raped on her walk to the library, we would never celebrate the solution of moving the library closer to the dorm. And yet, for some reason, this is okay for poor people. Now, the truth is, the traditional experts in economic development and poverty alleviation, they don't know how to fix this problem. And so what happens? They don't talk about it. But the more fundamental reason that law enforcement for the poor in the developing world is so neglected is because the people inside the developing world with money don't need it. I was at the World Economic Forum not long ago talking to corporate executives who have massive businesses in the developing world. And I was just asking them, how do you guys protect all your people and property from all the violence? And they looked at each other and they said practically in unison, we buy it. Indeed, private security forces in the developing world are now 4, 5, and 7 times larger than the public police force. In Africa, the largest employer on the continent now is private security. But see, the rich can pay for safety and can keep getting richer, but the poor can't pay for it. They're left totally unprotected and they keep getting thrown to the ground. This is a massive and scandalous outrage. And it doesn't have to be this way. Broken law enforcement can be fixed. Violence can be stopped. Almost all criminal justice systems, they start out broken and corrupt, but they can be transformed by fierce effort and commitment. The path forward is really pretty clear. Number one, we have to start making stopping violence indispensable to the fight against poverty. In fact, any conversation about global poverty that doesn't include the problem of violence must be deemed not serious. And secondly, we have to begin to seriously invest resources and share expertise to support the developing world as they fashion new public systems of justice, not private security, that give everybody a chance to be safe. These transformations are actually possible, and they're happening today. Recently, the Gates Foundation funded a project in the second largest city of the Philippines, where local advocates and local law enforcement were able to transform corrupt police and broken courts so drastically that in just 4 short years, they were able to measurably reduce the commercial sexual violence against poor kids by 79%. You know, from the hindsight of history, what's always most inexplicable and inexcusable are the simple failures of compassion. Because I think history convenes a tribunal of our grandchildren. And they just ask us, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you? Where were you, Grandpa, when the Jews were fleeing Nazi Germany and were being rejected to our shores? Like, where were you? And Grandma, where were you when they were marching our Japanese American neighbors off to internment camps? And Grandpa, where were you when they were beating our African American neighbors just because they were trying to register to vote? Likewise, when our grandchildren ask us, Grandma, Grandpa, like, where were you when 2 billion of the world's poorest were drowning in a lawless chaos of everyday violence? I hope we can say that we had compassion, that we raised our voice, and as a generation, we were moved to make the violence stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the talk. I want to.
Thoughts?
Wow.
It's a different view, just so you're not like concerned about the future. If any of you are child sponsorship people, Gary actually runs an organisation called International Justice Mission, and on the ground we all work in partnership. So like he mentioned the Philippines before, so their program that they've come up with at International Justice Mission, we train that to our parents and caregivers about how do you prevent your children being exploited sexually online and things like that. So we're working in unison with them, but it's a really interesting thought. What are some things that stood out to you guys?
The fact that I've never really heard about, like even in school when we talk about poverty and stuff like that, there's no mention of violence whatsoever. So it's very interesting just hearing about it, and after thinking about it, it makes sense. Like, yeah.
I think they're having to justify that we're making a difference when the lowest pool, I'm sorry, span, right? But $1.2 or $1.25
$1.25, yeah.
and then to up that to $2.
We've done it.
How can we justify
So that we've made a difference. Yeah.
75 cents and say we're making a difference? How can we justify our action saying, oh yeah, we're doing all that we can when there's that
Yeah.
many people still suffering?
Yeah.
$2.
Yeah.
75 cents.
Any thoughts, Paul?
Makes you angry, really. So, but it's, you know, it's common to hear at the time. Had some friends come back all over here from New Zealand, and they were telling stories, but I mean, they were even for them when I talked about a circle within the circle, they were in the protected circle, and they would tell stories about kids, you know, ages 6 being sent to work, you know, and introduced with markings and all the rest of it. So that it's yeah, it's really sad. And but there's light at the end of the tunnel when you see that and what they're doing and what you're saying, compassion. That's amazing. You know, that's great.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, so International Justice Mission is a Christian organisation, and they work alongside in different countries, alongside lawmakers, the policy makers, alongside law enforcement, but they also do some of their own rescue missions as well.
Do they have like military members or something?
In some places, all sorts of things.
That's cool.
Yeah. But lots of people have that. So even at Compassion, we have security specialists. So the guy who looks after the Asia region, I went to Sri Lanka with him in February because we were assessing some things. And he used to be an FBI agent, worked on 9/11, seen some pretty intense stuff.
That just sparks my interest. I'm just
Oh my
so
gosh.
nosy.
Yeah.
I'd be like, tell me everything.
But that's what you have to be sensitive as well, because that's traumatic. Like he's pulled bodies from, hundreds and thousands, not hundreds of thousands, thousands of bodies from those kinds of things. So that was a side thought. But when you, I think when you mentioned, like, it makes you angry, and I think that is a spiritual response as well. Like you can have a righteous anger at injustice.
Oh, amen.
Like I think back to, I'm going on a tangent, but we're going there. I think back to the story of Jesus when he's in the temple and he throws outlaws the tables, right? And so the thing is that everyone came to the temple on a pilgrimage because they wanted to worship God. And so what was happening was people were like, let's make people's pilgrimage easier by bringing what they need for it and selling it at exorbitant prices at the temple gate so that they can just come on their pilgrimage, pay these crazy prices so that they can worship God. And that's what outraged Jesus. He was like, you're making money off people wanting to worship God. And that's kind of and it was a thoughtful anger. He had time to make a whip. Like he didn't just like get angry. He made a whip and he is like, whip people up. He is throwing tables over. And that's like a perfect picture of righteous anger about injustice. All right, so we're going to go on to, I don't have, that TV is not on anymore.
Oh, do you want to go?
I mean, I can look up, but it's easier to look down. Sorry.
I can break it.
So this picture here, so when you think about injustice, often we're thinking of pictures like images like this.
Is that snow?
It's probably ash,
Right.
or it could be snow, or rain, could be
I
anything.
was like, snow in a desert?
The idea,
It's a bit weird.
yeah. So we think of images like refugees, we think of when we're thinking about injustice, right? We're thinking about child soldiers, thinking about child labor. And the reality is we actually live in, this is pre what's just happened in Afghanistan. I haven't gone to change my stats because I had a day. But pre-Afghanistan, there is a world where we are now, we have more than 20 million refugees and asylum seekers around the world due to violent conflict and persecution. Anywhere between 273,000, 520, those numbers there. Basically, between those large scale of numbers, civilians have been killed by conflict in just Syria alone. So most of them have been children. 5.5 million children are in slavery today. So these are the things we think about when we think about injustice, right? So I want you to do something. I want you to look at a label on your piece of clothing and tell me where your clothing was made. I'm going to bring it right home to you guys today.
If you can't read it, hold up. Do you want to read mine or read yours?
It's often in the wash instructions as well,
Maybe
down at the side.
USA.
Oh,
Let's go.
come on.
Okay.
Sometimes you have your tags down here though.
Oh, yeah. I don't think there's no tag.
No. Oh, there it is. I might remove that.
Where was your item of clothing made?
Made in China.
Made in China.
Made in China.
So we're not talking about China today, but the point is that you didn't know, right? So we make conscious decisions every day that actually impact the global economy. And so I wanted to start talking about fast fashion. So this concept of fast fashion, back in the day, fashion used to be in 4 seasons. That was very normal. And nowadays we work in these, like, you can see how many seasons, I can't even see how many, but it's this fast turnover of different trends very quickly. Ben's feeling convicted already. Hey, don't worry. Jeremy sat through this lesson and Jeremy had the same experience. So basically what happens is that production and processes are expedited to meet the needs of meet these new trends and getting things to market as quickly as possible. My keyboard's come back up. I don't want that. Why does that matter? What's this here? Basically this is in Bangladesh, and it's a place called Rana Plaza. So the Rana Plaza collapse was a structural failure that occurred on Wednesday, the 24th, 2013 in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And basically it's an 8-story commercial building that has collapsed. In the search for the dead, the search for the dead ended on the 13th of May, so good 2, 3, 4 weeks later, with a death toll of approximately 1,130 people. So, and above that, around 2,500 people were injured, injured people were rescued from the building alive. It's actually considered the deadliest garment factory accident of all history. So the building contained clothing factories. It contained, I think there's another slide, there's just a news article on it. A bank, apartments, several shops. So the shops and the banks on the lower floors, they were actually immediately closed after certain cracks started to show up on the building. And the owners decided to ignore the warnings and avoid using the building because of these cracks. Garment workers, however, were ordered to return the following day, and then the building has collapsed on them in rush hour. So several people have argued that the decision by managers to go send their workers back to work was due to the pressure to complete orders to buyers on time. A second line of argument gives partial responsibility for the disaster to the short production deadlines preferred by buyers due to the quick changes of designs referred to as fast fashion. So the reason this was made so famous, because a lot of brands that you would know were housed in this building. And in 10 minutes, the 10 minutes that we've been talking just about Rana Plaza, a Bangladeshi garment worker would have earned about 17 pence, which is 30 cents. And this is UK stats, but the UK retail industry at the same amount of time in 10 minutes would have sold 735,000 pounds, so 1.2 million Australian dollars worth of garments. So how does this affect us? We're like, oh, this is just a factory on the other side of the world. But it affects us because our buyers are all the brands that we buy and that we're wearing today. You know, I've heard many arguments for and against ethical shopping, and there's really two important links I wanted to share with you today, and you can look them up in your own time. So there's this interactive, really cool sort of experience that The Guardian have put on where you can click through and you can hear the full story of Rana Plaza, and it gives you some of those stats that I listed before. The next one is Baptist World Aid's Ethical Fashion Resource Guide. So every year they actually review a whole heap of brands that we purchase here in Australia. They do this in Australia, and they give them a rating out of what's good. And I think we need to understand that demands and supply chains actually are impacted by the purchases that we make. So inhumane working conditions and expectations for the sake of just a $10 shirt, is that us living out God's biblical mandate for injustice? It's a challenging thought. So that's the kind of COVID, the fashion report there. And so some of the things that they've pulled out about workers and suppliers and brands and consumers, and helps you kind of understand that bigger picture. All right, so COVID-19, conflict and climate change have actually reversed some of these advances that we've made in alleviating poverty and alleviating injustice. And for the first time in a generation, we're actually seeing a decline. So Gary talked about how those stats have been declining. This is the first time in history where actually it's turned around because of COVID. In 2017, the World Bank's research team estimated that there were over 6 billion people living in extreme poverty. That's living on less than the $2 US a day. So it's not the $1.25, it's the $2 US a day.
No, how many people?
6 billion.
6 billion.
Yeah. 6 billion. So 6 and lots.
Wait,
600 billion.
Yeah.
600 billion.
That's the population. Well,
600 billion people living in extreme poverty.
600 billion.
million.
Yeah, million. I've written my stats wrong. Sorry. 600 million. You're right. Population of the world is. Gosh, I'm like, where is it poverty? Oh, yeah.
Let's go say some people.
Do you know what's really interesting? Is this living off less like $2 a day for us is quite hard to comprehend. I have this budgeting app that I use, and every month it tells me what my monthly daily average spend is, and it factors in my mortgage, my bills, my spending, all of those things. And so I wouldn't say a frugal life, but I live a controlled life. And and it was probably because I also work for a charity, so I don't make lots of money. But I live off about $200 a day. It's a big difference. You can see how big the difference is.
Yes.
And so last year, the World Bank brought out this, so then we're going to talk about the impacts of COVID, because a lot of these stats have just been kind of turned over the head because COVID has turned our world on its head. So maybe we'll spend the last 15 minutes of this lecture just praying.
Yeah, please.
And the thing is, this isn't supposed to come with guilt and shame. It's, you can only just do what you can do.
Yeah.
Right? And so it is about seeking God, going, okay, well, you've blessed me, Lord. What do I do now? I'm definitely have that justice bend in my spiritual giftings. And I have to regularly be like, okay, God, what are you requiring of me right now because of what I'm aware of? Anyway, last year, the World Bank brought out a study called Poverty and Shared Prosperity 2020, the Reversals of Fortune. So this is the study here. It is like 200 pages long. So I don't know if you're going to want to read it. I've read it. It's interesting. It's free and available, and you've got the link there. So there are 3 key findings from the study that I'll tell you about. So COVID has caused an unprecedented growth in poverty. So prior to the pandemic, we were making considerable inroads in the alleviation of poverty. And in 2020 alone, it's estimated that an additional 115 million people will be pushed into that poverty line. And we're seeing that even on the ground with work. There is this hunger crisis happening because when you are a day labourer and you're in lockdown, you don't have stores of food to rely on, and you're really relying on aid in that moment. So to give you some perspective, Perth has a population of 2 million. So 50 times our entire city are being pushed in, additional to that 600 million are being pushed into poverty. These are massive numbers just from, the global pandemic. Second point is, in just 10 years, the effects of climate change are going to increase global poverty by up to 132 million people. So when you guys talk about environmental justice, you'll see the link between caring for the environment and also caring for people and how that happens. And the third one is, by 2030, 66% of the extreme poor will be living in fragile or conflict-affected areas. So this was written in 2020, and we're already seeing that now in Afghanistan and what's happening there. COVID has and will continue to make the needs urgent. Social justice, I think it's 2 words that we have that are really loaded with meaning. So we've got justice, which it talks about impartial, respectful systems that protect the rights of all people equally. And we see economic, legal, government, corporate, political, all different types of justice. Social then brings the focus onto the independent relationships we have with each other and these systems, which can either help or hinder the outworking of equality. And importantly, when we combine the 2 words together to say social justice, it's about recognizing the way our relationships and actions, big and small, collective and individual, have an impact on others, and thus encouraging us to change any self-serving actions that we may have, or systems that may harm others. Our daily lives, as we've seen by the clothing example, are interwoven into these global systems. From the food products we buy to the clothes we buy, the natural resources we use, so the petrol we put in our cars, and the multinational companies we support in our globalized world, all of these actions impact other nations, communities, and even individuals. And some of these systems add to and exacerbate social injustice. And as we saw with the Rana Plaza disaster, it's not actually always obvious. Like when you see a factory killing 1,000 people in another country, you're like, that's really sad, but how does that affect me? Knowing that the demand that you create with your purchasing creates the pressure of why they were forced to go to work when they shouldn't, when they were in unsafe conditions. So you can draw that to yourself. I'm constantly, all the time, struggling with this. Don't worry. I'm definitely on the journey as well. I have not reached the I'm saving the world moment. It's not happened yet. Because I'm trying to do it. No matter how hard, if we see linkages more clearly, we can be empowered to do more about social justice, and we can act for greater equality. We can live like Jesus lived and commanded us to live. Loving justice is therefore not trying to fix the impacts of inequality that we see, and it's about examining our own role in contributing to these unjust systems and doing what we can in our own lives and communities to promote and advocate for fairness and equality. And the importance is that as believing communities, we're actually aware and educated about these things, so we can actively go and do something about it. That's the essence of the lecture today. We've got 25 minutes. Do you guys want to have a specific thing you want to dive into and talk about? Do you want an early mark? Do we want to pray? What do we want to do? What have I got here? I probably have, where to from here? You need to go to the toilet. Go to the toilet. I have one of my favorite quotes up there is, justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And there were just a few personal next steps that I'd like to encourage you to all take, whether it's pray, give, volunteer, research, or advocate. Use your voice, got one. There's some really practical things you can do. Can be through, there are heaps of organisations, or if God's calling you, sometimes he's asking you to step out and start something new. Who knows?
Cool. That was great. Well,
Questions, comments?
It's heavy, it is
She's
heavy.
here right now, but whatever you want to ask her. What's the best thing you've done in your compassion job? What's the best thing you've done?
I think I've done. I don't know. I mean, I've had many moments where I've like God just breaks me. I'm like, Lord, I can't handle it anymore. And then I realize I can. One of the, like my last trip that I took before COVID stole that job from me. So because obviously that travel role, like we want to be good stewards of the resources that we have at Compassion. So all the travel related jobs got made redundant, and I was very blessed to be able to get redeployed. But the last trip I went on was, I mentioned, to Sri Lanka, and it was in February. It was really funny. I got a flyer about coronavirus as I got off the plane, as they herded us into this little channel where we all had to go very closely together because I don't think they understood the transmission of at the time. But we were in this one church up in the tea fields in Sri Lanka, so you know, where you get your Dilma tea from. And the pastor, we were in this room just chatting with the pastor, and we were actually supposed to go straight into, there was this child survival program where they have mums and babies, and they kind of help the mums raise healthy children, and they also like a sort of a support group for the women. So we're supposed to go into this room and spend some time with them, and we were running late as it was, and this pastor was in sharing his heart with us in this sort of side room. And I remember him kind of just saying, I asked him, I said, oh, like what's the percentage, because they were telling us about the way the tea plantation owners really exploit the people in the community. Like they don't pay them well, and they kind of put them in really dangerous conditions, picking tea. It's funny because I'm driving up these mountains going, it's so beautiful up here, not realizing that these are fields, sort of what, like Gary was saying, fields of exploitation. And I asked the pastor, I said, oh, so how many people in your church would you say work in these tea plantations? And he goes, he looks at me really strange, and he's like, 100%. Like every single person worked in these conditions. And he talked about how like he just had no support there. And so me and Michael, that guy who was the FBI guy, we both just kind of had like the Holy Spirit moments, but God just spoke to us. And we were able to really minister to this pastor who was literally about to give up. Like he was ready to quit. He's like, there's nothing I can do for these people. And he was ready to give up. And we were able to pray for him. And then we went into the room where the women's program was happening, and the women wanted to give testimony. And we'd get up and we heard all these women share about like wanting to commit suicide, having like all these crazy needs, and realizing like how the pastor was so important in that community. It wasn't the compassion program. Like, yes, that was really good. It was giving him resources to be able to reach the community, but it was really seeing like local church in action there. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but that's just what came to my mind when you talked about it. It was just seeing local churches reach their community. So like I love seeing that here as much as I love seeing it over there. I get really excited when I hear about things like the barista course that we did for like survivors. Like that's really exciting because that's meeting a practical need of those that are in, you know, they need a pathway to help them break free from those kinds of relationships. So yeah. Go.
So with COVID-19, like demographics of like where guys can't send field workers out to check what's going on, with resources and finances, and the help going to Onyx going to extend to help them, or even what that other body's doing in protection.
Yeah, international justice.
How's that? working?
Yeah, totally. Great question. So the thing that we have always prided ourselves on, that is actually a lot of our work is all done by local nationals and like highly skilled and highly trained local nationals. So there are people who are, you know, university educated that work in our national office there. The role that I was playing before wasn't auditing, it wasn't programs related. It was really still fundraising, and it was bringing people to come and see the work so that we could raise more money for the work, right?
Yeah.
And so in that being the core way of how we work, those systems aren't affected when we can't travel there because they live there and they have that insight into those communities. And we've had to actually respond really agile. So our normal program is based in a church where they come and they get the food, whereas a lot of it ended up having to be emergency like hampers. So we had to send people food parcels and hygiene packs, like we were providing face masks and things like that for people who couldn't get them. So it looked different. The accountability is definitely still there, and the auditing and the way that sort of happens doesn't change because that work was being done by local people anyway. They're not necessarily like local people living in poverty, they're highly skilled and trained people who happen to live in those countries. Other questions?
How about this? How about you pray over student rights?
Yeah.
Wherever.
Cool. All right. Father God, I thank you for this wonderful group of men and for this opportunity we've had today to explore this idea of injustice and your heart for the poor, Lord. So I pray that tonight, as these guys leave, that you'll really speak to them, that as they kind of mull and ruminate over the things we've thought about and discussed today, that you'll prompt on their hearts what the response you're calling them to is. Father, I pray that we would live as Christians who not just love you, but we love our neighbour as we love ourselves. And I pray that that mandate would just be so deep into the core of how we live our lives, that we will reflect your glory in everything that we do. So I pray that you bless these people here. I pray that you would just pour out your anointing on all their plans and their future and the ambitions that you've put in their hearts for your purposes, Lord. So I thank you for who they are, and pray this all in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Yeah. Let's thank you.
Thank you.